Hi folks, Happy New Year. I've had a few requests lately to do a tutorial about my digital process. So that is starting from scratch to get a kind of file ready to go through the vinyl cutter, and then after that we'll do all the manual processes. So that's what this video is going to be about. It's going to be quite in depth, it's going to be quite long, and it's going to be for an absolute beginner. So no knowledge of the platform that I'm using, which is Photoshop. Now, I know that people are going to look at this and go, hang on, Photoshop's not a design tool. And to those people, I say, it is. So I've always used it as one because my background is I'm a professional photographer. So I've just adapted the tool that I know very well to sort of meet my needs when it comes to making signs. It's maybe not the correct way, but every single thing I've ever made, every design I've ever done, everything that's in my Etsy shop, everything you've seen that I've made, it's all been designed in Photoshop. So despite the fact that it might not be the traditionally right way, it's a way that works. So this is a little bit of a niche video. If you're new to my channel, it might be something that you think is a little bit specific, because what I'm going to do is go over the tools required to make a sign, starting off with real basic stuff and making a basic sign, and then I'll go more intermediate and then more complex. Some of the tools I cover will be useful in photo manipulation, but my channel is not really about photo manipulation. So if you clicked on this video hoping for a sort of Photoshop tutorial that's going to get you started in that field, this probably isn't the one for you. If, however, you want to kind of learn some basic design skills that can be transferred to creating nice signs, nice glass pieces, then I think you'll enjoy this. Anyway, that out of the way, let's crack on with it. Right, so I've just installed Photoshop. It's the 31st of December 2024, and this is the most recent version. So I'm starting like this because I want to change a couple of things before we get started. These are personal preferences, but they're also, some of them are performance related, so they can make things work a little bit more efficiently. So I'm just going to go up to Edit, and then right down to Preferences, and then General. And General just brings up everything in your Preferences menu down the left-hand side. I'm going to start by going to Interface, and I'm going to change the interface to Pale. I prefer working like this because I think white text on a dark background looks a little bit blurry. So this is just an aesthetic thing, which you don't have to change. Then I'm going to go down to my workspace. I'm going to turn off Open Documents as tabs and enable floating window docking. What this means is if you have your documents open as tabs, it's almost like when you open different web pages, they sort of run along the top of the screen. You have to click within each one to open them. I prefer to work almost like my documents are scattered on the table so that you can just see them all. So that's just the difference there. The enable floating docking basically means if you drag one document over the other, it sort of docks into a separate tab within there. I find that a bit annoying, so I just have that off. Down to image processing, these are the performance related things. I'm just going to change them, and I'll discuss what I do a little bit later on, but I just prefer things to run more efficiently rather than kind of saving on processing power. So that's it. Now we need to either import a file or open a new file. So you can do that by clicking here, or you can go to File and New. The reason I showed you that way is because if you've got something open, this button won't be here. So anyway, let's click on it. This is what the default document is, and we can change it to whatever we want. So I'm just going to set this up as a standard kind of 8 by 10 inch. Well, let's go 10 by 8 inch. This is just your dots per inch. So I have this inches, just so that you know, 300 dpi is a print resolution, and that's what I'm used to working in with my photography background. Because we're kind of really just doing black and white templates, the color profile doesn't matter. But if you are going to end up working on photos, I would change it to Adobe RGB 1998. And then create. So we've now got a document. And we've got loads of things open that we don't need. So this can be a little bit overwhelming when you first open it, thinking it just looks like there's so much to it. And there is, but there's also a load that you're not going to need. So we can start getting rid of these. Firstly, this little thing here is relatively new. It's the contextual taskbar for using some of Adobe's AI features. I'm not going to be using that. So if we ever want to close anything, you can go to Window, and this shows you everything that's open. It's got a tick next to it, and you can uncheck it to get rid of it. So contextual taskbar, we don't want that. Rather than going through all of them in the Windows panel, you can just drag them out from where they are, and then they'll have the little X in the corner for you to close it down. I'm not going to be using any of these, so I'm just going to keep dragging them out and closing them. So what I'm left with is layers and paths. These are things that I want open, but I don't want them where they are. So I'm just going to drag them out. And that's sort of how I like to work. I'll always have my layers palette open, so I don't want it to be in some sort of side panel where it's docked in and I have to access it every time. Paths, not so much, but I mean, we'll keep them open for now. But what we've got down here is a shelf where we can drag the things that we do want quick access to into. So at the moment, history is in there. I'm going to leave that. Comments, I don't want that, so I'm going to drag it out and close it. So paths, definitely something that I'm going to want to access a lot. So I can just drag that into this side panel, and there you go. Whenever I need it, I can just pop it out like that. This, once you've kind of gone through and got everything you want in that sidebar, you can save that working space as whatever you want to. And that's up here by going to new workspace and then naming that what you want. I'm not going to do that yet because as we go through this tutorial, I'll be adding different things. So once that's done, I'll save that workspace. So before we get started, I'm just going to discuss a little bit about the properties of this document and how we can work in different ways. So this is almost like a page in a pad. And if we want to draw on it, so just bear with me with this, I'm just going to get a brush tool just for demonstration purposes, but I will go into details about the brush soon. So this is our document, and if we click and drag and paint on it, it's very much the same as painting on a page in a pad, which is you can't really do anything with it. So what I would always do, and this is why I always have my layers open, is if I click the plus icon here, that adds a new layer, and then when I paint on it, that's not on that pad, and I can move it around, I can transform it, rotate it, and numerous other things. So that's just my introduction, very brief introduction to layers, but this is something we'll use throughout this whole tutorial. So what I'm going to do is go down the toolbar on the left and the menu options up the top. So I'll start on the left with the move tool, which is at the very top, and you can access this by pressing V. If you hover over any of these, you get a little pop-out window and it tells you what it is and what that shortcut key is. And while V isn't necessarily the most intuitive shortcut key for the move tool, as you go down that toolbar, a lot of them are very intuitive. So for example, we've got M for our marquee, B for the brush, P for the pen, T for the type tool, C for crop. You know, so some of them really do make sense, and I'd urge you to get used to your shortcut keys because it's so much easier than keeping going down the side here. There are keys as well which access some of these menus, so as we go, I will be using the shortcut keys rather than clicking into the actual menus in the toolbar. Okay, so the move tool. While a layer is selected, you can see this has got a bounding box around it. Up here, we've got two checkboxes, Auto Select and Show Transform Controls. So Auto Select basically means if you've got multiple layers, you can choose which one you want to edit by just clicking on it on screen rather than accessing it in the layers panel. That might seem like a no-brainer, but there are times when you would rather not have this on. So for example, let's just duplicate this layer by dragging it into the plus icon here. And we'll just move this up here. So with Auto Select on, you can see in the right hand side in the layers panel, as we click on it, it selects those as we click on it in the documents. That's handy when you're working on quite big layers that aren't sort of overlapping. If, however, you've got things where, you've got things really close, and which is quite regular when you're doing design, you'll have layers upon layers of really intricate details. This becomes a little bit annoying because you can keep selecting the wrong thing. So I tend to have this turned off. There are options here of changing it from layer to group. We'll get into layer groupings in a bit. The show transform controls is this bounding box. So if we hover just outside it, we can rotate using the handles. If we click on over the corners or the side bits, we can scale it up and down. I tend to have this turned off as well. And the reason being is you can access your transform menu or the ability to transform by just pressing the shortcut keys Control and T. And that means you haven't got this distracting bounding box, which can, is a little bit unsightly while you're trying to do a design. So yeah, getting them up by a shortcut is my preference rather than having them on all the time. So I'm just going to delete these two layers so I can shift select them in the layers panel and drag them into the little trash can. Then we'll move on to the marquee. So the marquee we can access by pressing M, and it's basically a way of dragging a very basic selection, either a square or a circle. You do that by clicking and dragging on the screen. If you're not holding any buttons down, it's freeform, no constrained aspect ratio. If you hold shift, that'll snap to a perfect square. To deselect, you can either click outside of your selection or you can use the shortcut key Control and D. And if you want to switch to the circular marquee, you can either click and hold and go and select it. Or if there are multiple tools within that menu, you can use shift and the shortcut key that accesses that tool. So in this case, shift and M. And if you look on the left hand side, you can see as I press that, it's swapping between the square and the circle. Same thing, click and drag, hold shift if you want it to be perfectly circular. You can also hold shift to add multiple selections. And this is basically now just an area that you can either fill with paint, paint in with the paintbrush, and numerous other things. So let's just jump to the paint bucket and use these two tools in conjunction. So I'm just going to go back to my square marquee by pressing shift and M. Just drag a block, and now I'm going to go to the paint bucket. So we can access that by pressing G, but you can see that takes us straight to the gradient filter. Again, there's a sub-menu for this, and you can see that by any of these with a little arrow next to them. It tells you that there's something else within that tool. So I'm going to press Shift and G, and that takes me to my paint bucket. At the bottom of the toolbar, this is your colour palette. So let's click in here. You can choose your colours by just dragging around and selecting one you like, or if you've got specific values that are provided for you or that you want to use, you've got your hue, saturation, lab colour, CMYK, RGB, and the ability to input a hex code. There's also colour libraries in here, but for now, I'm just going to drag this to the bottom and just use black. And all you've got to do is just click in the selection, and that will fill that selection with your chosen colour. Now at the side here, I've done that on the background, which isn't what I want to do. I always want to work in layers. So just going to click the plus icon, and then I'm going to click in there. And now I've got a separate layer, which is filled with black. Few things which we want to get used to right at the start, and that is layer naming. So this is easy at the moment. Well, we've just got a background and a layer, but we can end up with 50 layers in a document. And if you don't name them, you just have to keep clicking through to see which one you need to use. So let's just double click on here, and that gives me the opportunity to name that. So we'll just call this black. So now we've got this block. I'll go back to my move tool by pressing V, And that means I can move this around the screen or I can transform it. So let's just have a look at some of those transform tools. So I'm going to press Control and T, or like I said, if you want to have them shown all the time, they're up here. So Control and T is the same thing. We've got Rotate. If you want to rotate manually, you just click and drag. If you want to rotate in increments that are a bit more accurate, you hold Shift, and then that does this so that you can definitely snap to your 45 degrees, 90 degrees, and a few others along the way. If you scale this up and down, it constrains the proportions. If you don't want to constrain proportions, you hold the Shift key. So if I hold Shift and drag up here, that's only scaling it in the axis that I want to. If you want to skew this, you can hold Control and Shift. This will allow you to pull out each corner. You also got Control, Alt and Shift, which will pull these out evenly. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at that because I'm going to start making a little border. Once you're happy with where that is and how it's transformed, you can press the return key. So we've got the start of a border now. And what we can do here, because I want this to be the same on all four sides, we can just click, drag, and duplicate that layer. So there's a perfect copy of that layer in there now. So let's just drag that out to the middle. Control Alt and T. I'm going to go to the rotate. And I'm going to shift click and drag. And then that lets me snap that around perfectly to 90 degrees. Drag this up to the top. Shift. Drag that out. And then return. So we've now got two parts of our border in two layers, but I don't need these in two layers. So what we can always do is combine these layers, and that's an easy thing to do. We're going to just shift and click, and you can go to this little menu in the layers panel and click merge layers, or you can press Control and E. I always advise you to use your shortcut keys. So I'm just going to press Control and E, and you can see that has merged down. Right, I'm just going to drag this into the plus icon. Now we could Control T, transform this by rotating it 180. But to do that, I'll just show you another way you can do it, which is in your edit menus. So if we go to Edit, Transform, you've got all of those options that we've done with the shortcut keys. You've also got some rotate options. So let's just rotate that 180 degrees. And now we've got a perfect border. And we don't want these as two layers. Shift select, Control and E, and there we go. So that's a basic introduction to using the Marquee tool, the transform handles, and a little bit about the paint bucket. Right, before we move on to the next tool, just going to cover rulers and guides. And apologies if the audio quality seems to have suddenly changed. I've just realised that my microphone wasn't connected when I've recorded the previous bit of the video. I'll try and make sure it's not that noticeable, but hopefully this bit from now on should sound better. So, rulers. We can access these by just pressing Control and R, and that shows our rulers in the X and Y axis. You can see there's something that's not quite right here. I made an 8 by 10 inch document, and this is saying 3000 by 2200 or something, which tells me that my ruler preferences aren't set to inches. So this is an easy one to fix. Just going to go to Edit, Preferences, Units and Rulers, and change that to the unit that you want to work in. So go to inches. Now we can see that's changed. I've got 10 across the top and 8 down the side. To access our guides, all we need to do is click inside either of the rulers, click and drag, and that drags a guide onto the document. And there, these guides have snap magnets to the center of the document and also to whatever layer is active. So let's create a new layer. Just going to click our plus icon, click and drag, press the G key to go to the paint bucket, and then click that in there. So now, if I go to my rulers and drag a guide out, you'll see this will snap to the edge of the active layer. which is a really handy thing. These guides might not seem like they're going to do much at the moment, but they're so good for kind of doing basic layout and making sure everything's aligned. If you want to be precise, add in a guide, you can go up to View, Guides, New Guide, and then you can put this at an exact point in the horizontal or vertical axes. If I'm going to work like this, I tend to change my units and rulers to percent. It's a lot easier to say that you want a guide 20%, 50% and 80% than it is to figure that out in inches or centimetres. If you need to change the colour of the guide, which you might be working on a document that's like sort of quite a cyan colour, that's in our Preferences menu as well. So I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, Guides, Grids and Slices. And yeah, you can see this is what we want to change. Change that to anything that contrasts to the document you're working on. I'm going to leave that as it is for now. If you want to get rid of one of them, or move it, you just hover over it, click, and you can drag it, and you can drag that right back out to the side. If you want to clear them all, you can go to View, Guides, Clear Guides. That gets rid of everything. You can show and hide these without clearing them by using your Control and semicolon. So if I just drag 1 and 2 to the center again, Control, semicolon, that hides them, and Control and semicolon, and that gets them back. So that is just a basic introduction to your rulers and your guides. Okay, now I'm going to cover the Type tool, and then once we've gone over the basic functions of that, I'm going to go into the Layer Styles menu. So starting with the Type tool, all we need to do to access that is press the T key. You can see we've got a little cursor here, which is our Type tool with a box around it, and if I click anywhere on this screen, it will then just add this random Latin phrase, I don't know what it means, and it will do it in probably the most generic font that there is, in this case, Myriad Pro. So, looking at the top here, we've got an option to change that font, and when you click on this, they'll have a drop down of every font that you've got on your computer. If that font has got different options, things like bold, italic, slim, they'll be in here. The size, the orientation, and then there's some warp tools and an extra little panel here, which we'll go through. So as I've just typed this, it's selected. If I am happy with what I've got, I can just click away from it. And yeah, there it is, ready as a layer. If I go to my Move tool, pressing the V key, I can then move that around. If I ever want to reactivate that as a type layer so that I can retype it or change things, I can press the T key, and you can see as I'm hovering outside of it, it's got the little box around the icon. As I get closer, that box goes. When that box goes, that means I can click anywhere and edit this. It means I can drag select it like you can in most applications. If you hover just outside, you see the cursor changes to a little arrow, which is the same as, I think it's the same cursor as your Move tool. That means I can move that around while the type is selected. If I go a little bit further out, then I click, then that's set, ready to move. Some things I will use on this type menu up here, some things I won't. For example, I very rarely use the actual type size because I'd rather use my transform tool to scale the type up to the size I want. So I can just go Control and T, and I can scale that up. And it just saves me like going through a load of different numbers with the sizing that aren't going to be right. So before we explore the others, let's just change this to something that looks a little bit better than that generic font. So let's just put, I'm just going to go in full capitals, Signs. So I can select this, and then I can pick a font that I want. Before I do that, because this font menu drops down covering half the screen, I'm just going to move this because I want to be able to see this as it changes. And this is a really nice feature because as you roll over each one, it will change it live on the screen. So, I mean, that's not a bad font, but I was thinking something a little bit taller potentially. So let's go to font that I know that I like. So we don't always have to just scroll through until we get to the one that we need, because there are times when you'll end up with, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of fonts. But if you know the name of the one you want, you can type this while this drop-down menu is selected. So I've bought quite a few letterhead fonts. So all I need to do, knowing that letterhead fonts all start with LHF, I can just type LHF, and that brings up all of my letterhead fonts. So I think something like this condensed old block is really nice. So I'm going to move this over here. But what we can see, the problem we've got here is that this box is black and this font is black, so I can't see it. So we can change the color of the font up here, and this gives you the same access as the tool panel, the color palette that I showed you earlier. So I'm just going to drag this into white and click OK. Just click on the move tool, or you can just click a little bit outside of it. Another thing you might come across, depending on the layer that you had selected at the time, your new type layer will be directly above that. So if I would have been in my border, which I sloppily haven't renamed, so it's just as we go, I'm just going to rename these. Bear with me. I'll go for border, box, and then the type layer is named accordingly anyway. If I'd have been selected on the border, my font would have been underneath it and I wouldn't have been able to see it. So it's easy to rearrange your layers. You just click and drag on them. So we've got that there. Let's press Ctrl and T to scale that up. If you hold on the Alt key when you click on the corner transform tool and drag, that'll drag it from that center point outwards. So something we can see, even though all of these things are perfectly centered, so if I click on the box and click the transform tools, you can see that's perfectly running down that center line. If I click on the font and press transform, although it's centered, it's clicking to those center snap magnets. Because it's a live font, some of the spacing is making this so that it's not perfectly centered. So we can tweak that manually. If I just press return, go to the move tool by pressing the V key, you can either click and drag this, or you can use your arrow keys on the keyboard to just do it up and down. This does this in micro adjustments, but if you hold the shift key, you can do bigger adjustments. So I think that's about central there. So that word looks okay. So let's put some more text on there. So I'm just going to press T. Bear in mind that I changed the color to white. So when I click, that's going to be white. I'm not going to be able to see it. So I'm just going to click there and then quickly change the color to black. That's retained the font that I used, which for now, that's fine. So I'm just going to put hand painted. Just going to move this, press the V key to go to the move tool, Control T to transform, holding the Alt key, scaling that out from the middle. Now we're going to have a look at some of those other type menu options. So I'm going to press T, hover until the box is gone, select all of my type, and up here I'm just going to go to this little box, which brings up a separate sub-menu for typography. It's not something that I'll necessarily dock into my side window and save there, because when you're on the type tool, it's as easy to click there as it is to click over here. So I just leave this one. So this just gives us a few more options. So the first one, we can alter the space in between paragraphs. So let's just move this up a touch. If I was to press return, and then, well, let's just type the same thing. If you're not happy with the space in between those two lines, we can alter that here. A good place to start is normally with the font size. So while I'm looking up here, this font size is 52. Something around that generally gives you quite a nice tight line spacing. But obviously, you know, you can scroll through these, and you can also type these values in. If you didn't want to jump, say, from 48 to 60, you wanted something close, let's go for a 52. So yeah, you can be really accurate with this. Another thing is the font spacing. And this is really important, not just because you can space out the whole word. So let me just delete this this line here, drag and select it all. If I wanted some different spacing on this, I can go, well, let's just go plus 100, and I think that looks really nice. But in some cases, I mean, these letterhead fonts are very well made, so they consider the spacing between different types of letters. Some aren't. And when that happens, you need to do these individually. So if I look at this on a whole, I do think the spacing on that is pretty good. But let's say I thought that this P looked a little bit too far away from that A compared to the rest of it. You can then just select that individual letter and then change the spacing on that. You can see that. So that might have been subtle, but that just nudged that a little bit closer. As it goes, I'm pretty happy with that as it is. I think that's a really nicely spaced line of text, so I'm going to keep that as it is. Go to my transform tool, Control and T, and then let's just align this with this little box. So it's basic, but I think it's looking really nice so far, and it's been really simple to get to this point. I think we need another line of text at the bottom, so rather than retype it, if I wanted to use the same font, which in this case I am, I'm just going to stick with the same font. Not that I advise that for signs, I think it's much nicer to switch them up. I'm just going to duplicate this by clicking and dragging it into the plus icon in the layers panel. Then I can just drag this down to the bottom. And then I can put whatever word in I want here. Press my T key. And I'll put made in Norwich, which is my hometown. Control and T to go to the transform, just drag that in, press return or double click, and we can nudge this with our little arrow keys to get it so that it aligns better with the top one. So, just going to move these out of the way and hide my guides by pressing Control and the semicolon. Now we've got a really, really basic sign design. Yeah, it's a single font, it's just a couple of marquees, but it's not looking too bad. So there we've got a basic sign, but I want to kind of make this a little bit nicer by using some of the warp tools. You might notice I've turned the camera off. I didn't realise till I was editing the video that it was covering this section of the screen, so I'm going to leave that off because there's no reason for me to have my face on the camera for the whole duration of this video. So anyway, let's start by making a change to this top line of text. So I'll just click on that with my move tool, that selects it in our layers panel. Control and T, and then using the Alt key, I'm just going to drag that in. Double click or press return. And I now want this to sit in a kind of box like this, but I'm going to make it curved. So I'm going to go press M to go to our marquee tool, drag a box around this word, and I'm going to create a new layer, but I'm going to create it underneath our hand painted text. So if I click on the layer below it, press the plus icon in the layers panel, and you see that's come underneath that. You press G to go to the paint bucket tool, and then click on that to fill it. Control and D to deselect, and we now need to just change the colour of that hand painted line to white so it stands out on that new black box. So we can either double click on the T in the layers panel, or we can go to our type tool, click and drag. So I'm just going to double click on that, go to the colour bar at the top, and then just drag that to white. And while our text is selected, you might notice this little icon up here is called the text warp tool. I think so. Let's click on it. Or the warp text tool, there we go. So this has got a drop down menu of kind of presets that are editable, and they're really, really nice. So I'm going to start with a real basic one, which is arc. At the moment that's a little bit high, but using this little slider you can sort of drag that up and down to get it to where you want. So let's go something, I think that looks quite nice, 24. So we'll click OK, click off it. So what we can do now is apply the same transformation to the box that sat behind that layer. So another click on it in the layers panel, or go to our move tool and click on it on the screen. You're going to press Control and T to go to our transform menu, And then up here, it's a very similar looking one, but it hasn't got the T over it. And this is your warp transform tool. So I'm going to click on that. This isn't how we want to use it. You can sort of manually drag things like this, but it's a little bit of a pain. I want to go up to this drop down menu, which gives us the exact same options as we had with the text. So I'm going to click on this. I'm going to go to arc. And I'm going to change the bend to 24 to match what we put in for the text. Go to the move tool or press return. Then using our arrows, we can move this into position. And there, really nice way of getting some curved text into a curved box. So I'm going to repeat that process on this lower piece of text. So click on that on the screen to select it as a layer. Control T, holding the Alt key, dial that down. Double click the T to make the type editable. Go to our warp tool and I'm going to go to arc. This time I'm going to go to -24. We could type these in as well as kind of using the sliders. Click OK. And although I didn't create a box first, I've already created a box that I can use. So I can drag this into the plus icon in the layers panel to duplicate it. And drag that down. Then I can go to edit, transform, flip vertical. Drag that into place, and then let's just change the color of our type to white. Just going to use my arrow keys to move that type down a little bit. So just before we move on to some of the layer effects, just want to address the fact that obviously in here, if you look closely, that is marginally out. And that's because this is an active text layer still, so it can have spacing afterwards, but not before it. And that sort of messes around with some of this. But we can just do tiny tweaks on that by selecting the layer, transforming it, and then just tweaking that round until you've got it so it looks about right. So I'm thinking something like that is a bit more like it. Is the bottom one okay? I think the bottom one might be alright. Might just need to nudge across a little bit. So click on it. Move that across a little bit. And that looks much nicer, much tidier. So everything I've shown you so far are functional tools in a way to create something in a document. But there are a couple of really important tools which help you navigate a document when you're working on something where you're going to need to zoom in and out. And that is your zoom tool and your pan tool. You can access them from the toolbar, but I never do. And I don't use the shortcut keys to activate them as a tool. So if I wanted my zoom tool, I could press the Z key or the Z key if you're American. And if I wanted the pan tool, I could press the H because it's like a little hand. But firstly, you can zoom in and out of a document by holding the control button and then pressing the plus and minus icons. If you're zoomed right the way in, you can also press Control and 0 and that will fit your design back on screen. But the easiest way to do this is to just use shortcut keys that just jump in and out of these tools when you click on them, and then as soon as you let go, they go back to the tool you're working on. So I'll go to the Move tool by pressing the V key. If I want to zoom in on a section of this, if I hold Control and Spacebar, you'll see that that changes to my Zoom tool. When I let go of Control and Spacebar, it goes back to whatever tool I'm on. So Control, Spacebar, and I can either click to zoom in, or I can click, hold, and drag to zoom into the area that you sort of clicked on. While you're zoomed in, if you hold the spacebar, you see the little hand tool appears. Let go of the spacebar, and it goes back to the tool that you're on. If you hold the spacebar down, you can pan around your document. And that is it really. It's just a really nice way of navigating your document, and I feel like I should have mentioned it earlier, but I'm glad I've squeezed it in now, so hopefully you haven't got this far following on and then struggled because you've somehow zoomed into something. But there you go, covered it. It's as simple as that, nothing more to say on the matter. So Control and 0, fit it back on screen. So we've got 2 layers that haven't been named. So I'm just going to do that now to keep the document tidy. You don't have to do this, but I advise you do it. It's just a much easier way when you can see these building up. You know, you don't want to have to be looking at the icon to figure out what you've got to click on. So I'll call this one top box. Okay, so we can access our layer styles by going into layer, layer style, and these are the options we have. Now at the moment we can't click on anything because we haven't got a layer selected, but I would never access it in that way anyway. So let's just click on a layer and we'll go with our signs layer. So this being an active type layer, if I click on the T, it will activate the type so that we can edit it. If I click on the name of the layer, it will activate that so that we can rename it. If we click anywhere else, double click that is, it will bring up our layer styles. So let's move this so that we can see what they do. So let's start with something that's really visible, and that is bevel and emboss. So you can't see this at the moment, but if we change it to a hard bevel, and then I'm going to change that size right up. So you can see that's giving us some relatively decent looking embossed effects on there. We've got the size, we've got the depth if we want to make that a little bit more contrasty. We've got the angle of light, so you can pan around this, get closer in or further out. We've got some curve presets. That might not mean a lot to you at the moment. Curves are a kind of way of altering the tones of an image, and you basically go from highlights to shadows, and these are different presets, but I'll cover that in a little bit later on. You've got the strength of the highlights and the strength of the shadows. So if you want those to be way darker or not so pronounced, maybe you can dial these up and down. So yeah, that is kind of quite an obvious one in terms of, you know, you can really see the results just from a few of the sliders. And yeah, it's a nice one to play around with, and you can get some really nice effects when you combine that with some of the gradient overlays. If you've done something and you're not happy with it, just uncheck it, like if you're not going to use it. Color overlay. So as simple as that. If you've got a particular color you want to overlay, rather than changing the color by using either the paint bucket or the text editing tools, you can do that. Why would you do that? Well, when you add layer styles, they aren't applied. They're a sort of separate subsection of that layer. So let me just show you what I mean by that. If I click OK, you can see now this type layer has got an effect layer. And if I want to show or hide that, I can just click on and off it. And these, you can have multiple layer styles attached to one layer. We can go back in there by double clicking here. That gets them open. We could then potentially add a stroke to this. So let's just click stroke, change that to white, and then dial that size up. So stroke is just a line that goes around the outside of that layer. And you can choose the positioning of it, whether it's on the inside, outside, or just running around the center. Choose the size, choose the color of that stroke. Let's go for something maybe a little bit brighter and a little bit more contrasting. And when I click OK, you can see now I've got my effects. I can turn them all off, or I can turn them off individually. So your layer effects are really, they're powerful tools, but they're also really nice because you don't have to commit to anything. If further down the line you think, you know, I actually want to go back into that stroke and change the stroke weight down a little bit, then you can. They're always there until you decide you want to make them part of that layer, which you can do as well. If you've added layer styles to a layer and you wanted to apply those to other layers, you don't have to go back into those panels. We can just select that layer effect and go to copy layer style. And if we go up to the layer that we want to apply that to, we can go to paste layer style. And again, we don't have to copy that again because that's copied to the clipboard, paste layer style. So you can see, really, really simple and a really nice way of getting some sort of quite traditional effects on there. So I'm just going to click through these and add a little bit of colour and some of the layer effects just to make this look a little bit more, well, not so black and white, I suppose. Now I think I'm just going to change the background colour to something that suits this a little bit more. So go into a colour picker, in something like a chamois type, really, really pale, creamy colour. Something like there maybe. Yeah, I'm quite liking that. I think it looks good so far. Right, moving on now to brushes and erasers, and the reason I'm keeping these together is because they act the same. You know, it's really the same tool, but one applies paint and one removes it. So let's start with the brush, and I can access that by pressing the B key, and what we've got along the top is our brush settings. So let's just pop in here and see what we've got. So it says we've got a 50 pixel brush with 0 hardness, which basically that means a very soft brush. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, I'm just going to create a new layer. Let's go into my color picker. Let's just pick black for now so I can show you what these are doing. And if I paint here, that is our soft brush. Just Control Z to undo that. We can dial up the size and we can dial up the hardness here, but we can also do it with shortcut keys, which is always the preference. To dial up the size, you press the square bracket keys. So the right hand side makes it bigger, the left hand side makes it smaller. To dial up the hardness and the softness, you hold shift. So at the moment we've got a soft brush, so if I hold shift and then press the square bracket key, if you keep your eye on this little icon up here, so let's press that, and you can see that changes the hardness. So now when I paint, that is a solid brush. We can change our brush settings in a separate menu, which I'm going to get out now. So I'm going to go to Window, Brush Settings. And what that's done is given us the settings to change the properties of the brush, and it's also given me my brushes. I'm going to drag these out so that they're separate. The brushes is something that I don't care to have in my sidebar, just because whenever I've got the brush selected, I've got access to that panel anyway at the top. The brush settings, however, is a really handy one that I do want in there. So I'm just going to drag that so I've got quick access to it. So let's just go in here and see what our brush settings can do. So let's dial that down a little bit. So for starters, we've got spacing. At the moment, you can see this is a little bit bumpy. If we wanted that completely smooth, we can put that spacing right down, and then that gives us a perfect line. If we wanted to kind of make that into a more kind of dotted effect, obviously we can just dial that up so the spacing is much further apart. Then when we drag, it's going to drag in those dotted line. If we want to paint a straight line, we can click, hold shift, click at the other end, and that will draw from point A to point B. We've got the ability to change the shape of that brush. So if we just squeeze that down, that's changing the aspect ratio. We can rotate it. And then if we go into the shape dynamics, we've got even more. So we can change the size. So the jitter basically means it jumps between, well, with the size jitter, it will jump to random sizes. If you've only got a couple, it'll only do it very slightly. If you drag it right up to the top, that's going to be much more pronounced. And it's the same with the angle. If you want this just to be completely random wherever you're painting it, we can put that right the way up. So let's go back to the brush tip shape. Let's change that spacing a little bit. So now if I go onto my canvas, click and drag, you can see we're getting some like really spaced out but very randomized effects here. And that obviously looks hideous, but it's just the way that I can show you how this brush works. You've got an array of brushes in here. So it starts with your standard soft brush and your standard hard brush. Then you've got some more art type brushes that act a bit more like paint brushes, and so on and so forth. If you use a graphics tablet, I'd strongly recommend utilizing some of the pressure sensitivity things on that, and they're up here. So if you click this will mean that your pen pressure determines the opacity, so basically whether it's transparent or opaque. And then over here, your pen pressure will determine the size. So if you're pressing very lightly, it'll be a very small brush. As you press harder, that can just get bigger. If you're going to do digital painting, it's a must. You know, you don't want to be trying to paint with a mouse. It's like trying to paint with a brick. But I'm not using one because I'm not going to be doing any painting. I generally am using this for just design, so I'm just going to use a mouse for now. So let's just get rid of that layer and then show you how some of this can be used with what we've got so far. So I'm just going to go back to the original brush, general brushes, and just choose a hard round brush. Now where we've just applied a layer effect to a load of different layers, that's not just applied to the bit that we've made already. That'll apply to anything that we add to that layer. So for example, this box, or no, actually let's say the border. Let's go into the effects and have a look. So we've got a stroke of a kind of deep gold colour and a colour overlay of this rich green. So if I paint on this layer, let me just make my brush a bit bigger and just click here. You see that goes on in that green with that stroke around the outside, and that can be really handy. So let's make ourselves a sort of nice little corner area that's a little bit better than just a rectangle. So I'm just going to undo that, go up to the corner, hold Control and Space Bar to zoom right in, use my pan tool to sort of pan it around to where I want it, and I want to make a little kind of, a nice chamfered shape in the corner. And to do this accurately, I can press caps lock, and that changes my brush to just show me the dead center of it. So if I just click here, there, that's just a round brush, but because it's now added to that layer, to that border layer, it's given us that nice sort of effect that I wanted. So hold the space bar, pan around, come down to the bottom, click here, space bar, pan across, and click in each corner. Control and 0 to fit on screen. There, and that's already looking much better, I think. But we can do the exact same thing with our eraser. So to access that, we just press E, and you can see that little icon on here. I'm going to go to a hard brush, hard round brush. Press caps lock so I can see the brush size. I want to see how big we want this. Let's say we want it something like that. So we're going to go to our box. We can either press the V key and click it, or you can go and access it in your layers panel. At some point, if you're working on this design, if you're following along, I think you will want to turn off auto select, because it is going to start getting a little bit annoying when you think, right, I'm going to go and grab that box, but you can't grab the box because it's selecting the text. So I'm going to turn this off now, and I'm just going to start going into my layers panel to access them. So click on the box, zoom right in, press B, go into the corner. Sorry, not B, it was E, wasn't it? Press E, caps lock. There. Now let's just space bar. Click again. Oh. Hold the space bar to pan across. And Control and 0 to fit on screen. So I don't know about you, but I think we've got a nice traditional looking sign going on here. So now I'm going to move on to glyphs. Now I'm just going to save this workspace. I'm going to go to new workspace and I'll call that Happy Gilder. At the moment I haven't created any new shortcuts, but if I do create keyboard shortcuts, I'll want them for any workspace, so I'll just leave that. So I'm just going to click save. Anyway, let's move on to glyphs. So glyphs are kind of bonus parts of a font. That's, I think, the best way to describe them. So when you buy a font, or you can download free fonts, you can check to see if you get extra characters. So let me just show you what I mean by that. I'm just going to press the T key and click somewhere on the screen. Let's just type Happy Gilder. And I'm just going to change the spacing back a bit. So go to this type editing tool again. And I'm just going to set that spacing back down to 0. Paragraph that is put in here, I don't want in there. So let me just get rid of that. Okay. So going back to a letterhead font, I'm going to type LHF. And this particular font is called Desire Pro. So let's just scale that up. And I mean, off the bat, it is a beautiful font, really nicely made and just really attractive anyway. And now I'm going to get up a little menu and go to Window, Glyphs. And now this is something I definitely want in my side panel, so I'm just going to drag that in here and then just open it. So let's just select this text. I'm going to double click on the T in that layer. And what we've got at the moment is every single letter, character and flourish and everything that you get with this font. But that's a nightmare to work like that. So what I want to do is go to alternates for selection. So as I select a letter, it will come up with every alternate version of that. So if I want to see those a bit clearer, I can just make this bigger in this window. But yeah, if I just click on one of those, that then applies that. And I can just go along selecting whichever ones I want to, double clicking on them. And, you know, as you can see, there's just some really nice ones within this font. It's probably one of my favourite fonts I've ever bought. But yeah, you can see that is just so easy to do, and you can just get so many variations. You know, if you think there's probably 15 or 20 different ones for each character, the number of combinations you should get on the same word, yeah, well, I can't do the maths, but it's a lot. That's for this particular font. But you can buy fonts that aren't letters. You can buy fonts that are ornaments, and I've got quite a few of these and I think they're really nice. So I'm going to go to one now. So I'm going to press T, click somewhere on the document. I'm going to go up to my menu, type LHF, and you can see here I've got Americana Ornaments and Americana Ornaments 2. There are some more where they're just ornaments and borders, but I'm going to go with this one. Go back into my Glyphs panel, change alternates for selection to entire font, because I want to see every single option that I've got. Then I'm just going to be searching for something that I think is going to go with this particular design. So perhaps something like that. Click on the Move tool, Control and T, scale that up. And I'm just going to move that somewhere just above the box and underneath the kind of curved box. And these ornaments, I prefer heavy ornament and basic font. You know, it's really tempting when you first start buying fonts to look for the most elaborate one you can find. But when you look at a lot of these old Victorian designs, they're more, well, the ones I prefer, like a lot of the Rawson and Evans ones, the fonts aren't particularly ornate. They're quite basic and blocky, and they rely on all that really nice scroll work. So anyway, got that there. We can change the colour of it. If you want to change it to the colour of something on the screen, while you've got your colour picker up, if you come outside of that, you can see that changes to a little eyedropper tool. That means any colour you hover over, you can click on it and it will change it to that colour. So yeah, I quite like that. I think that looks really nice in that gold. Click on the move tool and then we can duplicate that, drag it into the little plus icon, and the same as we did earlier with that curved box, go to edit, transform, flip vertical, and then just drag that down to the bottom. Nudge that with the little arrow keys, and I think we're getting somewhere. Still very basic stuff, but we're starting to get a nice ornate design. Right, so we've got a really good base for a nice sign, but let's start adding some little details using some of the techniques we covered so far. So I'm going to start by using my guides. Just going to hold Control and Spacebar to zoom into this kind of top box. Just stick that a little bit, Control and minus. I'm going to drag a guide to somewhere near the sort of middle down the side of it. Something like that. Going to do the same on the box at the bottom. Let's just drag a guide and bring that down here. Just hold the spacebar to pan. Going to do something similar up here where I want to find the exact corner where these sort of chamfered shape, if that's the right word, where they meet. We'll do that on each corner. Now press Control and 0. So starting with our top box, and just exactly as we've done before, I'm going to go to the B key and we're just going to add some little bits to these panels to make them look a little bit more ornate. So I'm going to press the right hand square bracket and Control, Spacebar, and then drag and zoom into this. Ignore the sort of pixelation in this. I know I'm working on a pixel based platform, but I also made this a very small file, and that's just for the sort of speed of working. But if you were going to make something, I'd strongly advise doing it at a sort of bigger scale than I've made it at. Anyway, let's just press caps lock so we can see the dead center of our brush. I'm thinking right where that meets the green, I'm just going to click there. That gives me a nice little shape. Pan that out to the other side. Do the exact same thing. Do the same at the bottom. Click that here. Oh, I'm on the wrong layer, aren't I? So select the bottom box. Click that. Control and 0. So now when I had a tiny little button that looks like it's sort of holding this on, or like a brass stud. So Control and Spacebar, zoom in here, and I can't paint this with a brush because this layer has got the layer effect, so I'm going to need to do this on a layer above it. So I can click the plus icon, press the B key, press caps lock so I can see the size of it. Let's just dial that down. To get this nice and accurate, we're going to go with a brush size that matches just inside there. Dial that down until you've got the size that you like, which at the moment you can see in the top left is 30, and then we can just click once. I'm going to go across the other side, do the exact same thing, dial this up, dial that down till it gets to 30, and then click. And I'll do the same at the bottom. At the moment this is a separate layer and we can add a layer effect to it. So, you know, it doesn't matter that the top and bottom studs are on the same layer. Click, pan across, make the brush a bit bigger, scale back down to 30, click. So now let's Control and 0 to put that on screen. I'm going to go Control and semicolon to hide my guides. And let's just double click on here. So we can now go to Color Overlay. And at the moment it's still remembered the last colour, which was that dark green, but I want that the same gold that's on the border of these panels. So I can just click here, come outside, and then just click on the gold with the eyedropper tool. And I'm just going to rename this. We'll call that studs. So we can turn those on and off if you don't like them, but I think they look really good. So let's show our guides again, control semicolon, and then we'll come up and do something in the corners here. So let's just scroll down to select our border layer, go to the eraser, get that to a size that we think is quite nice, maybe something like that, hold caps lock, then just click there. Going to pan across and then go to the corner of each guide where they intersect and then just click. And this is doing the exact same thing. We're erasing from this one, but it's obviously applying that stroke that's around within the layer style. Control and 0, see where we're at. So now I want to make a little dotted border that runs between these larger circles. So I'm going to create another layer for this. So I'll do it above the studs layer. New layer. I'm going to call this border dots. And before I even start, I want the same effect that is on my studs layer. So I'm just going to copy layer style. So it's right click, copy layer style, go to border dots, and then paste layer style. And even though there's nothing on there yet, when I do paint on there, it's going to apply that color overlay that's the same as on the gold studs. So let's drag ourselves a little guideline up here, something like that, and then one down the side. I'm not going to do it on all four sides because to make things even, I'm going to duplicate the top one to the bottom and the left one to the right. So press B, I'm going to go to my brush settings, going to space that out, give ourselves some nice dots, something like that. Size that down to how we want it, and then click, hold shift, and then click at the other end. And that looks really nice. So let's just go to the V key, and I'm just going to nudge this with the arrows because it's not quite central. That looks really good. So I can now duplicate that, drag it into the little plus icon, and then drag that down to the bottom. And I'm just going to do exactly the same thing down the left hand side. So that is new layer, paste layer style, B for the brush. It's already selected, all of the presets are in there. Click, shift, holding shift, then click, and then let go. Again, that hasn't got all the way down, it's just to do with the brush spacing and where it ends. So I'm just going to use my arrow keys to nudge that down a little bit to make that even. Drag that, duplicate that by dragging it into the little plus icon, and then just dragging that to the other side of the document. Now let's hide the guides, control semicolon, and that to me is nearly done. So let's just do a couple more tweaks, and I think maybe just something that gives us a nice sort of gradient on this background. Right, so I think this is going to be the last tool I cover in this video. I will finish by showing you how to tidy up this layer palette because it's getting a little bit unruly. There's a lot in there. But the last thing I'm going to cover is the gradient tool. And we can access that by pressing the G key. But at the moment, our paint bucket tool is selected because we'd chosen that at the beginning. So we hold shift and press G again, and that takes us to the gradient tool. So I can come right down to the bottom, click on my background because I want this to be behind everything. And what we've got, by default, we've got a set of gradient presets, gradient colors, some different kind of shades, but we're not going to work with those. We can make our own. This is what it will be by default. You've got gradient and classic gradient. I'm going to show you the new way of doing it because I'm using the newest Photoshop. I will cover how the classic gradient works just in case you're working in an older copy of like CS6 or something like that. But basically, you're going to click and drag, and wherever you click and drag from is where the colour will start and end. So at the moment that is saying this is a black to white gradient. Because I started it in the middle of the document, it started the black there, everything before it is black, and then where I ended it is where the white will start, and then it's solid white. Now that doesn't look very nice. What would be nicer is this, which is a circular gradient, which means it just does it from the center point and sort of goes outwards. Now obviously black to white doesn't suit this sign, so let's just Control Z, undo that. So you can pick what your gradient is based on your foreground and background colours. So to ensure this works, just go into Basics. So go into the gradient menu, go into Basics, and then click on that. And that's our basic original gradient. It's always been in Photoshop. So if I go to my foreground colour, and I pick, well, let's just pick off the canvas, and we'll go with that. And then we'll go to our background colour, which we can either do by clicking underneath it, or you can press X, so that switches them around, and then you can go in it and that makes it a foreground colour. So what I want to do is something similar, so we can click on that, but then go something that's a little bit heavier, maybe something like that. So you can see now that our gradient is the two colours that we've just chosen. I want to go back, I want it to go from light to dark, so that's because at the moment this is our foreground colour, so I press X just to switch them around, and I'm going to click in the centre and drag that out. And let's have a look at that and let's see if we're happy with that for starters. So it's going to hide my guides. I would say I'm not particularly happy with that. I don't think that looks very good. It's way too heavy here and you're not seeing enough of that lightness. In the classic gradient, you would have to redo it. In this new gradient, you don't have to do that because it creates, this is what we call an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer means very similar to a layer effect, you can always enter it and change things. So I've just double clicked on this, I double clicked on this little icon here, and this brings up what we've got, what we can edit. So let's just click on this first. So I just clicked on it and that brings up the gradient and it shows that it's going from this light colour to this dark colour, and that's it. But we can change that. We can add stuff along the way. We can add different sort of shades, or we can make it so that that is much lighter all the way and it only really kind of peters out to that that dark bit right at the edge. So I'm just pulling this. I don't think I need to do that, but that's starting to look a lot nicer. I might have gone a little bit too far with that. You can see what we can also do when we click on this box is access the colour. So if you decided that not too keen on that darker colour, it might be a little bit too heavy, we can go in there and dial that back a bit, which I think is a lot nicer. I think that's a good idea. So I'm quite happy with that. I think that's a nicer gradient than we had. I'm just going to click OK. And then you can edit the options here. At the moment we went with radial, you've got angular, reflected. I mean, I don't tend to use these very often, but that radial gradient is what we wanted. And I think that looks quite nice. So let's just click OK. The only thing I'm not happy with is the fact that it's coloured in these dots. I would have liked it if they stayed as light as that centrepiece. And luckily we can do that. And I'm only going to go into this a little bit in this video, and that is layer masks. But basically this thing over here is kind of like a separate page on top of this layer, which allows us to paint out parts of this gradient. I hope that makes sense. But let's just reset our colours. So to do that, I want my black and white. So I can reset our colours by pressing D. I want black. I want to click back on this thing here and then go to my brush tool. Now let's just change that brush because I know I've still got it set to that sort of dotted spacing. So go here, and that's just got me back to a normal brush, which I can edit the way I showed you by basically dialing it up and down using the square bracket keys and dialing up the hardness using Shift and the square bracket keys. So Shift, hard brush. And while I'm in here, notice this is white. If I paint in there with a black brush, sorry, my colour switched around again, so let me just press X. If I paint in there with a black brush, that's actually erasing bits of that gradient. If I then switch my colours by pressing X, I can paint that back in. Layer masks are something I'm going to cover in depth in our intermediate tutorial, which will be next. But for now, I just want to use this to get rid of that gradient in these corners. So I'm going to press X and go back to the black brush, and then click in all four corners. And I think that looks pretty good. So I said I'd cover the classic gradient tool, which I will. It basically, it doesn't give you the options to do this after the fact. You would basically have to put in those parameters first and then drag a gradient on another layer. So with our layers, we can hide them. So let me just hide what we've just done. I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to go to the gradient, and I'm going to change that to classic gradient. I'm on circular. It's remembered everything that we did to change it. So I can drag this back. So that was how we originally would have had a gradient. Control, semicolon, let's get this up. Click, drag. This is exactly what we did last time. And we get the exact same result as we did the first time around. Unfortunately, this is just a solid color pixel based layer. There's no layer mask, there's no adjustments. You basically have to do that prior to applying it. So you do that by clicking on the actual gradient and then having to do that and then kind of apply it and then do it again and apply it until you get it right. It's much nicer using the new way because you can see it change interactively as you do it. So let's just come off that. Let's just control, semicolon, and another quick shortcut, which is handy. Tab hides your tools, gives you a clear screen, and F, press F once, that will go to full screen mode. Press F again, and then that goes to a completely black screen. And it's just nice for viewing things on. I'd always kind of, as I'm working on a sign, will skip between these few modes just because I think you get a much better view of what you're working on when it's not got a load of clutter around it. So F again will take us back to where we were. Tab will get our tools back. Okay, so I think we've got a sign that looks pretty nice. Now I'm just going to go over a few things that you can do to tidy up this, not necessarily this file, but to make it nicer to work with when you come and reopen it, or if you're going to revisit this file at a later date. And what we've got here is just a load of layers that can be a little bit of a pain to just scroll through. You know, I don't know how many are here now, but you can see you're scrolling up and down looking for which one you need. And what we can do is group these. So let's say, for example, I've got all my border dots here. If I shift select those, then I'm just going to click this little folder icon at the bottom, or you can press Control and G. Now you see that goes into a layer group, and then that's hidden them so that they're not all sort of cluttering up that layers panel. You can do exactly the same as you can with the layers, which is rename a group. So we can call that border dots. We can rearrange any of these layers. So for example, where we've got made in Norwich should really be directly above our bottom box. So I've just dragged that, and that means I can shift select those two, Control G, double click on that, call that one bottom text. Got hand painted, that should be above the top box, so I can drag that down. Be careful not to drag it into a group. So you can see there, if I let go there, that will go into that group. But you can see that little thing, sort of a double line, says it's going to go directly under it. So shift click, Control G, double click, top text, and so on. So I'm just going to rattle through this rather than you having to watch me do it, and then you can see how much tidier that is. So there, that is much nicer. You can easily see what you need. You can just drop them down if you need to access them and then put them back up so they're a bit tidier. You can also, like I said earlier, change your auto select to select groups rather than layers. So if I press on the move tool, press the V key, go up to auto select, press layer group, and that means in here I'm now moving everything that's within that group, which is, it's really handy. Now this is kind of a concept design. You know, if you're going to make something, you want to be able to visualize what colors you want to use and where you want to sort of blend your paint. But ultimately, to put this through a vinyl cutter, you're going to need to get this down to black and white. And luckily, everything we've done on here makes that very easy, because everything is an adjustment layer or a layer style. So let's just take a look. You know, we've got our main text. This has got a color overlay. If you kind of wanted to change this all to black and white, let's go to a stroke. We can change that to white. We can change the color overlay to black. And we can do that for everything that's on here. So that's just a really handy way of working. You know, it's what we call non-destructive. So everything on here is still in a very editable form. All of the fonts are still live fonts. All of the adjustments are editable still. So we can just go through a few steps to get this back to a solid black and white design so that you can vectorize that to get it through the vinyl cutter. So I'm going to end that there. I know I said at the beginning of the video that I was going to do one long tutorial, but I put a survey out on the Facebook group and it was overwhelmingly in favour of me doing 3 separate videos, so the beginner, intermediate and advanced. And I really do think this is the right place to finish the beginner video. I've gone over enough tools for you to have a really good play around, and don't just follow the kind of design I did. You know, you can really kind of get used to making your own designs. Moving on, when we do the intermediate and advanced, we'll be looking at things like a deeper look at layer masks, the layer blend modes, how they apply to brushes and the paint buckets, some of the vector shapes, the vector tools, the pen tool, all pretty in-depth things that can get quite complex. But in the end, what I want to do is import an image that I've drawn. So I've done a hand-drawn design, import that in, and then just digitize it in Photoshop and get it ready for the next stage in the process. So really hope you found the video useful and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to the channel, click the little thumbs up icon and share it with anyone else who you think might enjoy it. All that leaves for me to say is Happy New Year and cheers.